So I had a couple kind of random musings or thoughts about religion and God that I thought I'd share. And I find that I've maybe been talking about God and religion more lately. And there's a part of me that thinks, well, it's just a function of some of the people I talk to on the show, are spiritual or have religion in their life, God in their life, and we have those conversations. So it's top of mind. Part of me thinks also, though, there's like an opening of my mind a little bit. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm embracing religion or my view of God has changed, but there's more of an openness to like, well, I don't really know. So we should explore all of this. A little bit too is like that term God, and I've had this conversation with some folks on the podcast. It can be used very loosely. It's the way I think of it sometimes is whatever created the universe in many ways, or whatever this is that we're in. That's God, and maybe it's a being, maybe it's somebody that looks like us, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's some force, whatever it is. With all that said, a couple thoughts I had that I wanted to riff on. So the first one is I often think like, so for example, I was driving home today and I was running a little bit late. So I was trying to get home and I kept hitting red lights. And my first reaction was like, well, this is frustrating, obviously. And my mind immediately goes to like, well, why is this happening? Why am I hitting lights now? Kind of thinking of it in a way of like there's not really an answer. And as I happened to pull up to one of the red lights, I noticed there was a couple women crossing the street and they must have pressed the button for the light to change so that they could cross. And I thought, well, that's interesting. There's the reason why, because those women pressed the button. But then I start thinking, as I often do, overthinking, well, but why was I at the light at the time that they pressed the button? Why didn't I get here sooner? And it's like, well, somebody was driving too slow 3 minutes earlier, and if not for that, I would have made the light. And you kind of play that out. And sometimes I do that exercise on random things like that, and it plays out to, well, the Big Bang. The Big Bang is always the answer. If you keep following the thread of why, there's this answer of, well, because the Big Bang happened, and then something else happened. I'm going to butcher this, but things started to cool, and helium formed, and other things formed, and then that happened, and then that caused hydrogen to form, and oxygen eventually, and life was born, and on and on and on. And then there's all these offshoots of that, right? Life was from this. That got me ultimately to that moment where that woman pressed the button, and I was stopped at that red light, right? So you trace it back, it always goes back to the Big Bang. And there's something, to me, very obvious in that, but also very profound and interesting to think about. And I should say, like, some people might say, well, actually, the Big Bang isn't the start, right? Maybe they're starting to realize that there's multiple universes, and that was just the start of our universe this time. Well, whatever it is, whatever started everything, whatever the reason is that there's not nothing and there's something here, that's always the answer to the question of why. And when you think about, like, well, what's the implication of that? It's like, there is a drive, there is something, right? Something caused it to play out this way. It might be, it's hard to say it's random, right? Because things happen for a reason, right? The Big Bang happened, and again, not scientifically accurate here, but things started to cool for a reason. Helium formed when these things started to cool for a reason, a very literal reason. Well, when gas cools, helium forms, whatever it is, right? And it's like, but why? Why is it that? And listen, it's certainly possible that it is truly random. Although I struggle with that a little bit because you get to that point of like, but why anything? Why did anything even happen, right? To say it was random, maybe, but what set off that initial event? And that made me think, it's funny, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody because I'm not particularly a strong believer by any means. I'm not sure if God is real and all that type of stuff, but one of the things I'll often do, and I think others do as well, is when people talk about like the story of creation, at least in the Judeo-Christian view of it, this idea that like in the beginning there was nothing, and then God created this, and it's, and I say this with all due respect, but just being honest, for some people that's laughable. Like that's such a ridiculous story that this Burger King looking person, God came and decided to do this and decided to do that, and put the animals on. When the story of evolution is there and all those other things, it makes that story seem, again, laughable. And it's almost embarrassing that people believe that, somebody might say. But I find it interesting because if you really step back and look at it, what that story is explaining, right? Okay, so you don't like that story, remove that story, it's ridiculous, okay. But look at the situation that it's explaining. There was nothing, right? Which is hard enough for our minds to mentally grasp to begin with. So what does that even mean, there was nothing, right? So that alone, already we're in a really abstract, ridiculous place. So there was nothing. And then somehow things were created out of nothing. right? Even the Big Bang, if that is the best explanation, or at least one of the strong explanations, the idea that something smaller than an atom could explode into what we now are today and it could all evolve this way, that is perhaps the most ridiculous thing of all. So to say, like, yeah, I totally believe that happened, and that's just reality, that's what it is. But the idea that some man came in, or some God, I should say, came and created it, that's absurd. Like, listen, everything's absurd. If our baseline is the start of the universe and how that even happened and what that even means, we're already living in absurdity. So that's not to say God is real necessarily. That's not to say the Judeo-Christian view is real and that there was a God who deemed, over the course of 6 days, created everything. Maybe. That's the point. Maybe. Like, is it really that absurd to believe that, given what the alternative is? And I just think that's an interesting thing. And I guess it ties back to where I started this video of why I find myself talking about God more. Because as you start to search for answers and you start to look for like the first principle, root level answer, you get to the idea of creation. And why are we even here to begin with? And that's where that God term comes in. And for some people, it's a very clear view of what God is. For other people, it's, again, whatever that explanation is, whatever that force may be that created all of this. And for some people, they might say there isn't a force. It just happened. But it leads you down that path. And for me, I've just found thinking of it that way, keeping an open mind to kind of understand it, it allows for, I guess I would say, more empathy for people that have different beliefs, different faiths. You can understand it maybe a little bit better. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to agree with it. But you can understand maybe why they do.